So, first of all, I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to join us this morning for our new webinar. It's with great pleasure that this morning we've got Iain Boyle with us of Highland Metals, who's going to present us their journey to net zero so far, what they've learned from it, the roadblock they face, how they went around those blocks, and hopefully, or not hopefully, I know it will be most valuable informations for people to take away. So in the meantime, in terms of housekeeping, as I say, put your microphone on mute and your camera off. So we've got a minimum broadband usage. That being said, the session will be recorded, and the slide you're going to see today will be made available. So that should be fairly straightforward. So I'm going to hand over to you, Iain, to show us what your journey to so far has been, and please let me know when you want me to move the slide onwards.
Thank you, Eric. Good morning. I'm just here to the kind of request of Eric just to give a bit of a background as to what we've found out as part of this journey so far. So if you go to the first page, Eric. I've got a brief outline of kind of contents here that kind of they're the main points that I would kind of like to cover, and I'll elaborate briefly on them, trying not to kind of stay too much on one topic for too long. As we had a bit of a trial with this yesterday, and to say I overran, I think it would be an understatement. So the main points I'm just looking to cover are just what we actually, or why we decided to look at net zero and kind of engage with this whole process. What we found out as part of that engagement, the plans that we've put in place, what we've managed to do and achieve so far, and what the next phase of this is going to be once we kind of really get motoring on it. So if you can move to the next slide, Eric, thanks. Just a brief introduction to us as a company. We're a family-run business. We provide a nationwide galvanizing and powder coating service, which is basically we coat other people's fabrications and material. We'll pick material up from fabricators all over the country, take it to our sites, coat it with the coatings that people request, and then deliver it back to them. Just over 100 employees across 2 sites. We've got a site in Elgin in the north of Scotland, and in Cumbernauld, just in the north side of Glasgow. Turnovers are about 12 million, but we're classed as a very intensive energy user, which is one of the reasons that we've looked at this and decided to engage in this. If you move to the next slide, please. Why did we decide to explore net zero? I think the first point on that slide there is the biggest, in that there's a recognition that our customer base, because a lot of it comes from oil and gas and renewables and government-funded projects, our customers were going to start to apply a little bit more pressure on us to provide information on what we were doing in terms of our roadmap and what our carbon reduction plan was. We've started to see questionnaires come through asking us about this, and we didn't have good answers. So I suppose that was a primary reason. The second reason is future-proofing the business, looking at all the regulatory changes that are going to be happening as a result of this drive towards net zero. We realised at some point we're going to have to do something, and we would rather do it in our own terms than wait to be instructed to do it and then maybe be constrained in how we could then apply it. It also ensures that, given that kind of fossil fuels are going to become less and less available, we're future-proofing the business, and that we're making plans now for when that happens, so that when the taps are turned off, we've got alternatives, I suppose, was the other way we looked at it. And we've also got a social responsibility. We're a very high energy user. We kind of produce a reasonable amount of carbon, not massive in terms of kind of international business, but for a small business, we're a pretty heavy producer of carbon. And there's a recognition that we need to do our bit in order to improve society. We also want to be in a position to say to people that are coming here to work or that currently work here that we are doing our bit, that we have recognised that we have this social responsibility, and we want to be a responsible employer, and we want to be seen by the outside world as a responsible business. And it also helps to clean up the image of kind of galvanizing in particular. It's quite a dirty, heavy-duty, heavy industry, I think, is how most people would recognise it. And in doing the things that we need to do in order to achieve net zero, we help deal with a lot of those issues. And finally, there is, without a doubt, there's opportunity. Going through this kind of process, we recognise that the coatings that we provide actually lend themselves very well to things like the circular economy, improving sustainability, because they're designed to increase the life to first maintenance. And even just through the various different forums and webinars that I've attended, we've identified opportunities that we're actually going to be able to exploit, that's going to increase our business, which is, so from our point of view, it's a win-win. It's not without its challenges, but I think it's certainly been a worthwhile learning curve so far. The first thing I think I would advise anybody on is to spend as much time as you can and invest that time in understanding what you need to do as a business to kind of get an understanding of where you need to go to. So can I go to the next slide, please? There are a myriad of different guidance documents, different standards, different ways of approaching this, and I think by attending a number of the kind of, in particular, Scottish engineering webinars, I was able to kind of hone down a few of these things, a few of these standards, in particular the kind of greenhouse gas protocol, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and the procurement document from the government, PPN 0621, I think it is. These standards all have a very kind of consistent theme, and it's about setting your boundaries, getting a good understanding of what your inventory is, and putting that together into a framework that suits your business. So my first piece of advice there is, from what we found out through this kind of process, if you don't invest the time in trying to understand what it means to you, then you're not going to get very much out of it. What I would caution against is thinking that, especially if you're a small business, just going out to the market there and just hauling in a third-party consultant who says, right, I'll set out your roadmap, I'll set up the systems that you need to, in order to be able to demonstrate that you're working towards net zero, or put your carbon reduction plan together. You'll find yourself spending as much time with somebody that you're paying to do the job, and you end up doing it yourself anyway. It's all your information, it's all your kind of thought processes, it's all your interpretations that go into the kind of the roadmap and the journey. So I would give people that advice, is take the time and invest the time yourself to find out what it is you need to do. The second, before you can actually do that, I suppose, is you need to get the backing of the senior management. If you don't have the backing of senior management, then you're not going to get to spend the time on what you need to do and what you would like to do. So that in itself is a process. But don't underestimate how challenging that can be, because there is a perception that it's a kick the can down the road. Certainly, I found that, and that there was a lot of a kick the can down the road scenario. But with a little bit of persistence and sort of my charm, I think I've managed to kind of convince people that that it's definitely the right way to go. It makes business sense, and it is reasonably straightforward. The next, once we'd kind of got a good understanding of what kind of net zero meant, I think the next phase we went through is we wanted to establish a baseline. We did get third-party help with this, but it was going into that kind of consultation process with a good understanding and a good background understanding of what we wanted out of it. Because if you don't know what you want out of it, you're just going to go around in circles and spend a lot of money and time on something that's ultimately not going to fit the profile of your business. We were really quite fortunate in that there was a local KTP student who had just finished a KTP at one of a kind of large company that's based in the northeast, and they were looking to set up on their own. And they contacted us, this kind of one-man band contacted us and offered us their services. So I sat down and had a chat with them, and we thrashed out our scope 1 and 2 emissions pretty straightforwardly, because it's not complicated. It's the fuel you burn and it's the electricity you use. That's it. That's scope 1 and 2. When it comes to scope 3, it does become a bit more complicated, but essentially you can decide. You can draw your boundaries and say, right, okay, this is what we are going to include in this at this moment. But if you're subscribing to something like the greenhouse gas protocol, for example, you can decide, you can narrow in on the ones that you think you can have effect on right now, and then look to increase that scope over time. And I think that's the approach that we've taken, is that there are a number of scope 3 emissions that we have absolutely no control over, no chance of controlling it at the moment. So we're focused on the ones that we can. And this chap, Michael, from a company called Carrollton, he was actually really helpful in helping us hone down that scope 3 so that we can actually make a difference. The other thing that I suppose we learned is that unless technology changes, we as a business are never going to be net zero. We can't be. As I mentioned earlier, we're a high energy user. We need a massive heat input. We've got 2 sites that have 250 tonnes of molten zinc that has to remain molten 24/7, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. It can't go solid. So without a ready replacement for natural gas, then we are stuck. There are a couple of alternatives that are kind of in development, like, for example, electric furnaces. They are incredibly expensive. It would require a massive investment in terms of changing out the infrastructure of how the business actually works. So we're trying not to go down that route at the moment. Hydrogen is a possibility, but again, that's in its very early, that's in its infancy. There's no regular and consistent secure supply of hydrogen yet, but there are obviously big plans for that. And so we had to reconcile ourselves to the fact that, yes, we would like to be net zero, but we know that if the technology doesn't exist, then there's absolutely nothing we can do about it. Come the day that we want to say that we're completely net zero, we're just going to have to offset. But what we've done is we've pushed that date out as far as possible in the hope that technology allows us to actually be properly net zero, rather than offsetting and taking a bit of a shortcut. Can I get the next slide, please? The planning stage, once we'd kind of been through the kind of baseline setting and the kind of understanding of where we were as far as technology and kind of what was available to us was concerned, the obvious things you look at are, can we reduce what we're using? So we again employed the help of an outside party there, but again, you need to be very careful how you select these people. Well, that's certainly in my experience, that's what I've found. I went to a website called the Energy Managers Association, and they've got a number of registered energy managers on that website, and I just selected a few locally to us, and they were all one-man bands, maybe a couple of guys working in partnership. And the aim there was to try and spend a bit of time with them and understand, see where they were placed in terms of being able to help us, because we're reasonably, well, we like to think of ourselves as being reasonably competent, and that we know how our business works, we know where our energy uses are, we know what the kind of obvious things are, and we kind of dealt with all of those things. So what we were really looking for is kind of specialist help with reducing heat loss, primarily, and possibly a little bit in terms of reducing our electricity consumption. So we engaged the services of kind of John Wilson, and we found that beneficial, but I'll kind of cover that just in a sort of couple of minutes' time. So reduce the consumption was the first phase. The second phase, the timing of us looking at kind of setting a baseline and making improvements was actually, it was quite convenient actually. We were due for an electricity renewal and gas renewal. So we picked a renewable contract. We signed up to this sort of signed up to the agreement in sort of early 21 for it to kick in later 21. So it was kind of round about the kind of peak of energy prices. But the tariff that we were offered versus, the renewable tariff that we were offered versus a non-renewable tariff, the price difference was negligible. So it was a bit of a no-brainer, given that we were on a bit of a flexible deal anyway, and the likelihood was energy prices were going to come down, and then that differential between renewable and non-renewable may actually increase. So if we signed up at that point, then the chances are overall we would maybe make a small saving, and we also have the benefit of almost zeroing our scope 2, which is a good chunk of the way towards making big improvements in terms of our carbon emissions. Third, identifying alternative fuel sources. I've touched on it kind of briefly. Now we use natural gas and electricity, and that's our kind of primary sources of energy. We also have a fleet of forklift trucks. They're all diesel at the moment. So without making decisions around that, then we're definitely not going to be able to meet any kind of target. A kind of broad target base is kind of following the kind of linear reduction of the SBTI, without necessarily wholly encompassing that philosophy, because there's a number of things that we can't do at the moment. But it's the main focus is reduce your energy consumption, reduce your diesel consumption, and then look for alternatives. And the alternatives are out there. We could go out there today and buy an electric truck, or we could go out and switch to HVO fuel or another form of biodiesel, which doesn't necessarily eliminate your emissions, but it brings your emissions down. So you're able to actually meet a target. And the next thing on the agenda was we have great systems internally for measuring how much things cost, how much was spent in certain areas of the business in any given month. The systems weren't so good, excuse me, at identifying how much of something we're actually using, and the volume of that. Electricity and gas were obvious ones, but things like diesel, we just filled up the tank every month, essentially. It cost us what it cost us, and didn't really measure consumption. The amount of water that we actually use, we use a lot of water in the process. The amount of waste that we produce, and what those waste an understanding of those waste streams. Our systems didn't allow for that, so we had to make changes in that regard. And then we looked at business travel, which was an easy one, given that there's this kind of platform that we're using today that allowed for a lot of certainly intercompany travel. Excuse me, between the two sites, that allowed that to be reduced quite significantly. And then we put in a policy of kind of, why are we going to see that customer? We're just going to see him because he's on the list, and we've not seen him for a while. So we've made some changes there. And then finally, we've had to engage with our supply chain. Go back to what I was saying earlier on about kind of reducing the size of your scope 3 inventory. What that's allowed us to do is allowed to focus on the big hitters, and that's primarily transport. We use a third-party transport contractor, excuse me, and our zinc supplier. Zinc is one of our biggest cost outside of transport and labour. So we had to engage with them in order to establish what they were doing in terms of measuring carbon, so that we can then report it within our scope 3. Okay, can I get the next slide, please? What we've done, as I mentioned very briefly, we've taken care of all the low-hanging fruit as far as energy consumption is concerned. We've done this over a number of years, like for installing variable speed drives in our compressors, installing heat recovery units in the high heat users, and all that kind of thing. So it's there wasn't very much for this third party to come in and point out, but he has identified a number of kind of heat loss solutions. In other words, better insulation and lagging, and our awareness now is that there are better products on the market than that we are currently using. So we were able to kind of identify some measures that we can take to do that. We moved to this the electricity in Europe, sorry, a renewable electricity tariff. I've set up better systems internally for measure, but they are essentially, they're not embedded within the business processes yet. It's essentially me gathering data on the side in an Excel spreadsheet and reporting separately on it. Where we need to get to is we need to embed those recording systems actually into the business accounting process, so that it becomes something that's reported on naturally as part of our kind of monthly reporting. And further engage with our supply chain. We've been really quite fortunate in that our transport provider, ARR Crabe, they're part of a national group called Gregory Transport, and they've got a chap solely dedicated towards their journey towards net zero. It's not a part of his job, it is his job. So he's set up very robust systems where I now get a monthly report from them on the carbon emissions associated with each site as regarding the transport that we've used. So that's literally a take the figure off of his report and stick it into my Excel spreadsheet, and that's the kind of job done. Our zinc supplier, similarly, it's a multinational, so they've obviously got big pressures on them internationally to be able to report accurate figures as far as carbon production is concerned. And the particular products that we buy from them have their own carbon certificates, for want of a better word. Their systems are audited, and we get a certificate that says that the zinc that you're buying produces X amount of carbon per tonne. So I can then build that into a kind of small spreadsheet that I've got in terms of tracking our own production. Business kind of travel. Here's the difficult one. Great for cars. We don't have any company cars, fortunately, but anybody conducting travel for business records mileage, and for the taxman's purposes, we've got very good records of that mileage. However, if somebody chooses to use public transport or decides to make that journey another way, then our systems need to be improved. But the systems that we actually use right now for our car journeys are actually really quite good and robust. And then produced a very kind of broad brush roadmap. It's nothing fancy, nothing sophisticated. It's not great graphically, but it just tells us what it is that we want to try to achieve. So if I go to the next slide. Essentially, we set our baseline in April 2021. We're working in financial kind of periods here. And that baseline was an average of the 3 years pre-pandemic. The reason we decided to take the kind of an average of the 3 years was that we have massive peaks and troughs in terms of our energy consumption, and especially the intensity. So the CO2 produced per ton of steel that we process. So we've took an average of those to try and flatten out some of those peaks and troughs. We switched to renewables in 21. We've got a number of energy reduction projects on the go, primarily around insulation and lagging and preventing heat loss. There is some equipment that we need to purchase that's more energy, it's less energy intensive, sorry. And we have plans. We are going to have to, if we want to meet the targets that we've set for ourselves, by April 28, we're going to have switched our forklifts to an alternative fuel. What that fuel is yet, we don't know. We've got our eye on a couple of balls as far as what's achievable is concerned. But the economics of it will effectively decide when it gets to the point of making a decision. So that's 2028 is our decision-making point, with a view to meeting our targets for 2030. And then in 2040, we need to start to reduce our reliance on natural gas. And again, I've asked those two bottom ones there, primarily because it's completely out of our control, and the supply and distribution of hydrogen, for example, we can't do anything about. We can keep our finger in the pies at the moment so that we know what's going on and have a good understanding of where it's likely to go. But we can't do anything about it. So come 2044, if we are not in a position to be able to replace natural gas as a fuel, we're going to have to offset. And that's essentially, that's the commitment. And we're hoping, or our kind of our main motivation is that is not the case, because as a business we don't see the offsetting as a solution. We would much rather reduce our carbon emissions than just buy the credits. So can I move to the next slide, please? So what's next for us? We need to develop our IT systems so that CO2 is recorded as part of the monthly reporting, especially on the financial side of things. I want to see it as a line in the financial statement, much like a number of bigger organisations have to do legislatively at the moment. We need to improve the kind of systems for employee travel, both to work and journeys other than by car for business. We need to finish off the energy reduction kind of plans, and we're looking to get third-party verification, so that once we've got our systems a bit more robust, we're looking to try to get a third-party recognition so we can actually start to shout about the journey that we're on. I don't necessarily want to scream and shout about this until we've done it. Neither internally or externally. The internal promotion and kind of how I see that developing is giving incentives or disincentives to employees to reduce the times that they use a car or they don't actively travel. I think I was mentioning to Eric yesterday that about 90% of the people that work on our site in Elgin live within 2 miles, and 100% of people drive. So I think there's incentives that we can put in place there to try to encourage people to maybe either walk or cycle to work, or at least reduce the number of times that they take the car to work, whether it's car sharing is another good example. I hope that's me pretty much come to the end of the presentation, but what I'm hoping that people take away from it is essentially, one, that there's not this huge mystery around it. Once you actually spend the time to understand what it means to your business, you quickly realise actually there's a lot of things that you can do reasonably straightforwardly that will start to put you on that journey. And it is a journey. We kind of get ourselves worked up a wee bit right at the start of this about what the result was going to be. I think our methodology, our philosophy is slightly changed in that we've reconciled ourselves to the fact that we've identified what we can do. We'll do it, and there are factors out within our control that we can't do anything about. But what can you do about that? There's nothing. But get a good understanding of your business and become confident and comfortable in the action that you can take in order to reduce your carbon emissions. Thirdly, there is an absolute myriad of help out there. Through Eric, I was pointed in the direction of people at Zero Waste Scotland, and even HIE have actually helped us out a bit just with, and it's all free help, but you could information overload yourself with it. So be selective about what you engage with, because you can, and learn from my experience, I disappeared down a rabbit hole, and you end up spending a lot more time and not really getting the kind of benefit of that unless you really try to kind of consolidate what it is you're like. I want to reduce scope 1, I want to reduce scope 2, I'll think about scope 3, but I'm not going to worry too much about that at the moment because I know there isn't an awful lot I can do about it. And kind of thirdly, there's opportunity. There is business opportunity. I was certainly a number of us sitting on the board were kind of sceptical about that. But once you start to kind of dig under the kind of the nonsense and the kind of technobabble, you start to see that there's actually quite a lot going on across various different industries. And you will, without a doubt, you'll identify opportunities for either increasing the levels of business you're doing in your current business line, or opportunities for diversification. That's me. If anyone's got any questions, feel free to spear me. But other than that, it's back to Eric.
Well, thanks a lot, Ian. That was great. I think, to your point, a lot of what you've talked about today is relevant, and a lot of what you talked about today is what I'm hearing when I'm doing those one-to-one. I've done over 260 one-to-ones since the start of the program, and it's exactly what people are facing, and what we're trying to do is to demystify that net zero. It isn't as complicated as it sounds like. So please, if you've got any question for Ian, either come off mute and ask your question, or put your question into chat. Sarah, I'll be grateful if you could read the chat question if they come up.
Yeah, no problem. We've actually got one here just from Angus Douglas, and he's asking how's the engagement with staff at Highland?
Well, to be perfectly honest, we've kind of done the kind of staff engagement thing a while ago in terms of trying to reduce our energy consumption. So at the moment, until this is kind of properly bedded in to the business, people know what I'm working on, but I'm not really promoting it. The board are certainly far more behind it than they were previously. There is a recognition and a far more of a sort of desire to actually achieve this. which I think is a big positive. But I think below board level at the moment, we're not at that stage yet. There's not an awful lot that these people can do yet, which I think is we're trying to phase this so that the things that the big things in terms of consumption we've done before we start to engage staff, so that we can actually turn around and say to people, look, here's what we've achieved so far. Now we need your help to go over the next line.
Thanks, Ian. How you fit in your day job as well, by the way?
Sorry?
How are you fitting in your day job as well?
It was difficult to start with. I think, to be perfectly honest, there was the kind of learning this and understanding it was the bit that I struggled with, that as well as doing the kind of the day-to-day stuff. But I was given carte blanche to do that. It was, as a board, we decided we had to, and we decided it was probably better to have somebody in-house doing it than it was to bring somebody else in that didn't understand the business. And once you actually get a bit of an understanding, you do quickly realise that there isn't a massive amount that you can do. You obviously have to rely on others to help. But in terms of understanding and then directing the traffic, it wasn't a massive undertaking. Initially, it was. I found that quite difficult. I spent a lot of time. And I've read right through the whole. I don't know if anybody's seen the greenhouse gas protocol, but it's an A4 document. It's about that thick. I read it from cover to cover, and I did the same with a number of different standards. And what I found is that was a rabbit hole. I was like, I'm wasting my time here. So speak to people that know. So Eric was on my speed dial list for a while until I got the understanding, and just spend the time doing it. If it is a priority, it's much like anything else. If it is a priority, you'll find the time. If it isn't a priority, there'll always be a reason to kick it down the road, and that's the switch that has to go on. And it's a priority. It's part of the business. It's part of a business. It's a business process. We need to understand this. Much like if there was a breakdown in the plant, for example, somebody would have to understand what the problem was before it could be fixed. That's a priority. So you have to see it as a priority and accept it's a priority.
Thanks, Ian.
We've got another question here from Scott Duncan. So they've said, for calculating Scope 3 emissions, do you have a largely UK-based supply chain, and do you see that as being an issue?
We do have a largely UK-based supply chain. Our zinc provider is international. A lot of our zinc comes from either Norway or Republic of Ireland, and the transport emissions associated with that have been a challenge to identify and calculate, because what the zinc supplier has done is he's done essentially it's the emissions associated with the production of zinc. So it's within his own boundary, basically, are the numbers that we've got. So to get accurate transportation figures from the plant that we buy it from to the distribution centre that it comes to has been challenging, because we use a broker. We don't buy it direct. So getting that information has been a challenge. The kind of 2-hour door has been reasonably straightforward, because we're largely UK-based supply chain. We run the transport to pick it up. We use Crabes to pick everything up. So all the transport that we use for the collection of our raw materials and are included in the transport Scope 3. So we've been fortunate in that regard, and I recognise that. But I think when it comes to Scope 3 and international or importing raw materials and materials that you use, then I can see that being a challenge. I don't know how to overcome it. I've put the pressure on my broker that we buy the zinc from to give me the answer. He hasn't given me it yet, but I think that's something that's out with your control. So what I've used is I've used just secondary data from the government's own conversion factor tables, and I've estimated the mileage that the shipping would take, and just incorporated that, and I've just got a note on the side that that's secondary information. It's not what I would call good, really clear, auditable trail, but that's all we can do at the moment. And I think we have to reconcile ourselves to it. It's frustrating, but just live with it until we can get the answer. And we will have to get it, because the pressure is going to be put on, not just by small businesses, but by larger businesses, onto the broker, for example, to provide that information.
Okay, that's great. I think so. If you have any more questions, you put them into chat or put them to us, and we can put them to Iain, and it would be able to come back to you. Now, looking at the next slide or the next presentation on the webinars, what I want to talk about today is the Carrollton and the stick approach, and that's something that Iain has made allusion during his presentations. It's just about be ready before it hurts, basically. And what we're going to look at is the ambitions, especially the ambition of the Scottish Government, what the drivers are, what the carrots have been put in, and what the progresses the carrots have delivered, and then the sticks coming away potentially, and do a takeaway from all these. So that's what I want to talk to you about today. So the ambition is very clear. It's net zero by 2045 at the latest. That's the Scottish Government ambitions. They've put it into an act, so it's a legal requirement, and they've developed a roadmap in essence, with a base year of 1990, a target year of 2045, some interim years, and specific reduction during those interim years. So this is what the government wants to achieve, and this is what the government has said it will achieve legally. It's bound to achieve it legally. So to help with that, there is a pathway, and in one hand, you've got the climate change plan, which develop a roadmap. That's a Scottish Government document. And also you've got a pathway that's been designed by the CCC, which is Climate Change Committee. And the Climate Change Committee is an arm-length organizations that review emission from the government, being the UK government or being the Scottish government. And what you have here is, on the left-hand side, is maybe even in here, what you've got is the blue or the purple line is the original target. The target is, then they were revised, and that was the green line. So because in 2020 it was higher than schedule. So that's what they were trying to do. And then now what the committee is recommending is a red line. So it's still achieving net zero in a worst case scenario by 2045, but that's what they see as a more realistic approach than the one that's been given. So the climate change plan here gives you a roadmap to 2032. So that goes about here, and how it's proposing, the government is proposing to get there. So they've got a roadmap, and they've got a process to achieve that roadmap. So what's the takeaway from that piece is the government has legally committed to net zero, and net zero by when? By 2045, which is 5 years ahead of the UK, which is 2050. And then around the world is anywhere between 2040 and 2060 for anybody having an international business. And that is assessed, reviewed, and measured every year legally. It's in the act by the Climate Change Committee, who's an arm's length organizations. So what are the drivers? Who cares about net zero? Well, everybody cares. The consumer cares, and they care because that's the social side of things. That's again something that Iain mentioned, though that's what people are asking for. And because the consumer cares, the customer cares, because the consumer drive the customers. And because the consumer cares, the employee cares. The employee and the consumers are the same, and that's what we talked about again. You know, people don't leave their value at home when they come to work. So they will care, and they want to work for employers that cares too. And the competitors cares, and they care because they see it as an opportunity. They see it as a commercial opportunity to get there on time, to get a differentiator, to do something better than other people. So the competitors cares, and organization cares. And it cares because the competitor cares, because the customer cares, but it cares also because, to Iain's point, it has opportunity, has value to it. And that's why more and more organizations are pledging to get net zero. And the government cares. And they cares because the consumers, who is the employee, is also voters. And they cares because it's an opportunity for income. It's an opportunity for tax. It's an opportunity for reporting. And that's what we're going to be looking at in more details today. So who cares? Everybody cares. And if you look at the driver for climate change commitment, why do people sign up to it? No, that's again referring to the first slide from Iain. You know, what's the driver behind this? And then the top two are indeed about the consumer and the customer. So they want you've got the top one is the consumer, the second one is the social shift we talked about. And then you've got the organization. You've got the executive motivation, because it's the same thing. The executive is the same than the consumer, is the same than the employee. So the C-suite has got the same value. And they want to look at the brand. Again, 2 points highlighted by Iain during his presentation. So the organization cares. The competitor cares because they see an opportunity, a commercial opportunity, and also they care because it's about access to finances. So that's why the competitor, especially new one, the disruptors. The employee cares, and that's another driver of all those climate change commitments. And finally, the government cares because of regulations and reporting requirements. So those are the big drivers of why you would go down that journey. What would you go through the pain of developing that roadmap? And there is a lot of good reasons, and those are the main reasons driving it. And then, as I said, you've got government commitments, and you've got government commitments in Europe, in the UK, but all around the world. And all around the world, people are either implementing things from a legal point of view, or some of them are under consideration, some of them are in place already. And you've got some of them in April 23, you know, you've already have 73 schemes in force. And one of them is the UK that's got ETS, which is emission trading scheme, and carbon tax. So that's what you have. But where government cares again is because it generates revenue. And globally, you're looking at $100 billion of revenue generated by the net zero or the carbon tax sort of things. And then there is also the price. The price in the EU is going up, and it's now at €100 or $107. It depends on the exchange rate, but €100 in Europe. So you can see how things are becoming significant financially for government, and that's why they care. So the takeaway from the driver is all the stakeholders care. You know, and it's either ethical responsibilities, we talked about that, you know, social responsibility with the consumer, the employee, you know, it's about profit. If you think about the customer, it's driven by the consumer, driving profit. You know, we've got competitors, you've got the organization itself to stay ahead of the competitions. And last but not least, you've got the government. The government have made commitments, government have put in place carbon tax, government have put in ATS, emission trading schemes. So that's the takeaway. That's everybody cares. So what is the carrot? The carrot has been investment. And the Scottish Government, if you look at that roadmap, 2018 to 2032, that's the sort of commitment they are making. So it is quite substantial. It's a lot around travel. It's a lot around energy. So it could be electricity, it could be hydrogen, it could be emerging technology. Travel could be active travel, could be anything to do with buses or transport, train, that sort of area. As well as the recycling. There is big drive for circularity, another topic that I think Iain mentioned today. So they are committing to significant investment. Do you see them all the time? That's another question. Do you have access easily to them? That's another question. But they are committing to invest. So that's the carrot. And one of the first websites I usually recommend when you're trying to find some information on what your funding and support is this website, dynastical.gov.scot. And if you looked at it yesterday, and for support option, being funding or otherwise, you've got 552. So that could be quite a lot cumbersome. So you may want to look at net zero specifically support, and that goes down to 252. And then you want to find what's about funding, and then that goes down to 68. So it becomes a lot more manageable. And that goes back to simplifying it all. That goes back to, how do you streamline all that information? How do you get overloaded? That was one of Iain's experience. And then you can go down and look at, so the chapters, these climate change has been divided into chapters, and that's what you've got here. So you've got less funding if you feel that you are part of one of those chapters, so being electricity, building, transport, the industry, which is mainly where things are going to be. And here, for example, you go down to 55. So now, if you want to look at funding for net zero in industry, you only need to look at 55 options. It's a lot more palatable than looking at 552 of them. So that's a good place to start. It's not everything, it's not holistic, but it's a good place to start. So the takeaway from this is the Scottish and the UK are making substantial investment. They are putting a lot of money or committing to put a lot of money. I know we've just had an announcement from the UK government, which is not great, but a lot of businesses are pushing back against that announcement. A lot of experts are pushing back against that announcement. Businesses are struggling because they are not getting clear directions. Things are moving, and working with a moving target or moving goalpost is not ideal for businesses. They like certainty. So what's the progress? Well, the progress has been rather disappointing, to put it briefly. So if you look at Scotland specifically, those have been the emission to 2020 in Scotland. And then if you look at, there's been a recalculation, so the inventory, so greenhouse gas account is just a recalculation, which is fine. But I think the important thing is how often that target has been missed. So if you look at 2021 to 2017 over 5 years, it's only been met once, and that's in 2020, and we know why. That's the outcome of COVID. That was an easy one to meet. Nobody was traveling. Businesses was decreasing. So that's what happened. But overall, if you look at the ambition and the actual, then it's not great. It is disappointing. And here, it's not about reading what he says, but it's about looking at the color, and there is not a lot of green. Those are some key milestones, and you can see there's a lot of red. If it's not red, it's orange, but there is no green. So that's another area that shows it's not really happening. In here, what you've got on the right-hand side, that was the current targets, to 2027. That's what it's actually been. So missing the target, and even the high ambition scenario is looking like it's not going to make it. So that's why you're looking at a rather disappointing scenario coming up. So the takeaway is, despite all those investment, we keep on missing the target. So we keep on not being in line. So there is proposal by the Climate Change Committee of how to go back in line, how to go back on target and what needs to be done. But it is going to be challenging. And because it's going to be challenging, then be ready for the stick. And the stick is about reporting and taxonomy. And what do we mean by that? So if you look at the SME, there's a recognition that in the UK, the SME are the bulk of businesses. And as a bulk of businesses, they account for almost 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So SMEs are going to be looked into. At the moment, the large organizations are already falling under reporting requirements, but SMEs are exempt from it. And what the UK government is looking at is to automate SME sustainability reporting. So reporting is coming, they're trying to simplify it, working with bankers to try to get it there, or a simpler business, a simpler way of doing it for SMEs, but it's still coming up. So it goes back to Ian's point, is how do you get ready for that? And then if you look at the timing, again, they want the banks access to finance to support businesses in tracking their greenhouse gas emissions in order to access capital. And they want to start a program, a pilot, by COP28. And if you're wondering when COP28 is, it's in December 23. So it is coming soon. It's over the next few months. So that's what you're looking at in terms of reporting. At the moment, reporting is mandatory for large organizations, but you may see it coming in for smaller organizations because small organizations are responsible for a significant amount of emissions and they want something simpler and they're already working on it and they're already looking at pilots. And then you look at taxing. So if you look at a recommendation from London School of Economics or the Institute of Fiscal Studies, which are driver for such recommendation to the government, then they are recommending that there should be a carbon tax, a single carbon tax, or an emission trading scheme. And then that emission trading scheme should go further than only the small amount of emission is considering. Even if it doesn't cover all of Scope 3 emissions, then they want to get into that. So how do you extend it? They also recommend taxes on aviation because they see aviation as being subsidized, especially the long haul, and that's due to no VAT on a ticket. And they are looking also, those guys are recommending that we may want to have a border tax. So it's basically emission related to imports. So if you think about, again, the zinc coming from Norway or Ireland, and they are looking at how do you tax, carbon tax at the border for imports. And they recommend that the carbon needs to be raised and it needs to be at least 50 pounds per ton of dioxide. But their recommendation is for a raise of the carbon tax. So that's regarding the taxing. And in terms of taxing, what we need to realize is that the vehicle for taxation already exists, they are already in place. So it's not about building or creating new taxes, except for those ones, energy and other sectors. But all the others being, fuel duty, being excise duty, carbon levy, all those already exist. So they just need to change the amount. They don't need to change the process. They don't need to change the methodology. So that's one of the things. And in terms of taxes, so that's what pardon me, I was saying earlier on, air transport is no VAT, so it is low subsidized. You can see how electricity is significantly more taxed than gas. But one other thing is the average price here should be 80 pounds per ton. So I mentioned earlier on 50 pounds per ton, but those guys are saying 80 pounds per ton. So that's the main takeaway from this, as the vehicles are in place, exist, and they just need to be changed, adapted to the needs. And then procuring. So again, the government has the procurement notice that Ian mentioned. And if you wanted to bid, and that's where your customer comes in, you may be a small organization or an SME, and you will not be bidding for those large major government contracts. but you may be supplying someone who does, and for that someone to answer that question, then what the simple way for them to do it is to come to you and say, what is your carbon reduction plan? Because I'm going to use it in my carbon reduction plan. So you need to have a carbon reduction plan, and that needs to be published. So it needs to be online or available. And then that needs to address and be net zero by 2050. Include all scope 1 and 2 and some subset of scope 3, 5 of the 15 categories. So again, that's a lot of it is about transportation and waste. That's basically the one they are trying to cover, which is the one that Iain mentioned during his conversation, during his presentation. So those are the key area. And then it needs to be in line with the greenhouse gas protocol. So the methodology have been highlighted for that procurement notice. Pardon me. So what you can see here is we've looked at reporting, we looked at taxations, and now we're looking at procuring. So the governments are making move in terms of getting people on the journey to net zero. But not only the governments, you've also got the customers and the big companies I mentioned earlier, the multinational companies are already looking at getting there. And for that, they are planning to remove from their supplier list the laggard, the one that don't move. So again, if you look at opportunities, if you look at the reason why Highland Galvanizer went onto that journey, then that's a reason why, because people or large organizations are looking at moving away from suppliers that don't go down that route. So you've got on one hand the government, but you also got the customers. So what's the takeaway? The takeaway is reporting is already in place for the large organization, and it's coming and it's going to be being looked at, and it's likely to come for the small organization. Taxonomy is on the rise. You've got new taxes are being proposed, recommended, and some of them have actually been implemented. And more importantly, I think the taxation vehicles are available. So it's not about designing a new process or a new tax or a new system. And as well as government and stakeholders are starting to take notice. We knew that from the consumer, we knew that for the employee, but also now the customer, the competitors, every stakeholders are taking care of it. So to summarize where we are today, the ambition to achieve net zero has been legally set. So it's a legal requirement, and it's net zero by 2045. Now, the investment is not working, but you need to get ready. You need to get ready for the stake of reporting and taxonomy, because it is coming, because the carrot is not working. And how can we help you getting ready? As the one that Iain mentioned, is we've designed that 7-step process in trying to demystify what net zero is all about. And the key things here is it's agile in the sense that the first 3 steps of the process we've designed are valid regardless of the methodology you use. At that point, you need to choose your methodology, so a way to measure it. But those first 3 steps, and therefore getting on a journey, is fairly straightforward, and it's not as complicated as it may look like, or as people may want to make it sound like. So that's my summary for today. I would like to thank you all for coming and joining us today. But more importantly, I would like to thank Iain for joining me and doing a very good presentation. I thought you got a lot of information from that. And I'd like to thank Sarah for joining me and supporting me in that process. And I'm going to open the floor to any question you may have. So Sarah, again, if you can read either the one I come on the chat, or come off mute and ask a question.
Yeah, Eric, you mentioned about funding and the fact that funding is not working. One thing I have found is that there's a huge amount of funding out there for businesses that are involved in innovation, kind of developing new technologies and kind of the future. There's not so much funding there for businesses right now that where there is carbon reduction technology available, but it's maybe cost prohibitive at the moment. You're not necessarily going to get a financial payback on it at the moment. There doesn't seem to be an awful lot of funding streams available for existing businesses using traditional methods of business processes, where there is a carbon reduction kind of technology out there. There aren't a lot of business funds or funding streams for that, and I think that's one thing that I would kind of say to the Scottish Government. If the funding kind of model at the moment isn't working, then we should maybe look to diversify it a little bit, because there's too much of a reliance, I think, on the new technology, because that might never materialise, in my view. The solutions to those problems may never materialise, whereas there are practical solutions right now that small businesses can take, but they're prohibited by capital expenditure.
Yes, so we supported businesses in getting access to those grants. Like we supported one of our members in the Low Carbon Manufacturing Challenge Fund, for example. But what I'm finding out as a general term, there is a few challenges. The first one is you still need to invest. I don't think there is that much funding where it's 100% funded. So you still need to have a substantial investment as a business to develop something. Because of what's happening, because of the target, a lot of the funding is linked to a carbon reduction plan. So if you don't have one, or if you don't have a journey or a plan or anything like that, then it's unlikely you'll get any funding. And the third thing is looking at, the contribution in kind. That's what you want to maximize, because you don't want cash out. So what you want to do is a contribution in kind. But again, the funding systems may include or exclude some of those contributions. So that could be quite challenging. So I agree with you. You're correct. There's a lot of commitment. We've seen those millions that are being committed. But in terms of accessing it, it's a bit more challenging.
And just on one other point that you mentioned about the kind of the taxation, the reporting, small businesses having to report. We as a business, we require what's called a PPC permit to operate. So we need to meet certain environmental kind of requirements before we're allowed to operate. And the kind of the framework for that PPC permit is changing. It's gone through Parliament by the end of this year, and then from then we'll have 4 years to meet the new requirements. And one of those requirements is to have a carbon reduction plan and to annually report on progress against your plan and your targets. Fortunately, we'd started to engage with this before we found this out, but it's already, so there's roundabout ways, let's say, of forcing SMEs to provide the information and kind of report on these things and force them to do something, rather than just taxation, because there's and we found that because of the size of our business and the resource we have, we're not in a position to kind of do that easily. Whereas a number of our competitors are properly national, and they've got multiple plants nationally and internationally, so they have a much bigger kind of infrastructure for this sort of thing. But it's coming, and there's nothing we can do about it. So forewarned is forearmed, I suppose.
Yeah. So I'm just showing a slide that I took out of the presentation as a backup, but you can see there's a lot of things. So the legislation, the mandatory are for large organizations, but there's a lot of things in place which today are voluntary, and they wouldn't be difficult for the government to make it mandatory, because it's already there, it's already in place. And the big one is access to finance, the investor-led. More and more investor wants to know what the risks they are exposed to. Any question?
Hi, Eric. It's Athena from Spirit Aerosystems. Similar to Iain, I'm quite interested in what people can do today, because I equally see a lot of technology that's being pushed into reality, and it's kind of like very much on the supplier side as opposed to the user side. So my perspective is I'm really interested in engagement, because at the moment people like Iain or myself, like, it's individuals, a very small percentage of a population in a company being extremely sustainability active, and then the vast majority waiting for some type of threshold or benchmark or something, like some kind of pain barrier before everybody's on the journey. So I'm very interested in what skills could be, like, I think these seminars are amazing. These do cluster the right people and give things that have been done and seem to show good success. I really like the 7 steps, but even that is quite a giant step when you want to engage individuals on a daily basis that go, well, I'm going to try and increase the sustainability active population, and how can we do that inside a company? Like, which are the best colleagues for me to pull in on day 1 or day 100 or day 200? Because getting more people involved is actually a really big challenge. So do you guys have views on?
Yeah. So I agree with what you're saying, I think, and it's related to what was talked about early on in one of the question I was put to Iain, I think, is what do you do in your day-to-day job, and whether they sit in a priority of your day-to-day job, and does that just get kicked in the wrong grass or every time a new challenge comes up. So for me, it's about leveraging for engaging the employee. It's about leveraging their value and get them involved. Employees wants to get involved. They want to have, if you want, the opportunity to leave what I call a positive legacy, and that's the way I think you're trying to engage them. The 7-step process is, that's where I think I talk to a lot of organizations where they try to figure out what they can do, and then they put in place how they're going to get there. Whereas what you really want to start with is a vision, and how do you share that vision. So the first 3 steps, which is about your vision and your ambition, is where do you want to be by when. Doesn't matter how you're going to get there yet. And that's what Iain showed us. They got the board on board. They said where they wanted to be, and now they are figuring out how they're going to get there. So I think that's what you want to do, to engage the people, show them that's what we're going to do. And the reason we're going to do it is because of A, B, and C. So, one of the slides I quite like is that there is no planet B, so there is no plan B. And just back from holiday in France, and one of the sentences I saw, you don't inherit the planet from your sister, you borrow it from your children. And that's, for me, that's a big message for engaging people. That letter to your son and daughter, I knew about it, and that's what I did. Does that answer your question?
I think so. I still, like, having tried to do it a few times, I still think while the regulation and legislation you can see is voluntary, it could become mandatory. I just wondered if there was, like, across industry, almost like training the sessions where you're like a grade 1 sustainability person, so this set of data, and then you kind of increase your definition of an employee's involvement, almost, because more on the people side as opposed to the reporting side, because I think success has to be based on the people, right? Some of our skills are transferable. You might leave your job, you might do a different role, but as with Iain saying, you know, the investment of the funds and grants are really pushing the actual machinery or the physics of technology. The embarking of the brains behind getting things active and the time scale for that, it's almost like, oh, when the technology is ready, everyone will suddenly be on board. And I just think that's a little bit unrealistic.
Yeah, so I think in terms of funding and for people training is very limited, if not inexistent almost. But what you'll find is, and the challenge, and that's what we're trying to address at Scottish Engineering, is that it will be fairly generic. It'll be a net zero generic training. So what we're trying to do is how do we make it specific? So it's a bit like what Iain mentioned earlier on about, you know, consultant, be careful about the consultant you're using, because at the end of the day, you are the one that know the business. So you still need to do the legwork. They do the number crunching for you, but you still need to do the legwork. So for me, it's the same thing here. If you could send people to any training, but the training would be generic on net zero. Why do you do it? And to that extent, we are currently developing a training course for people on net zero, and specifically on the 7 steps. So hopefully that should be available before year end. But otherwise, you know, I think that's what we're doing through a one-to-one program, is how do you make it specific to the organizations, because everybody is a bit different.
That's helpful to know that you've got a training course coming, because the 7 steps is really good. So I think that's really positive. Thank you.
Thanks.
Can I just add? I think looking at trying to engage our own staff here. What my experience, I have so obviously spoken to, but I've never really kind of pushed the engagement thing. Me personally, I think it's better that we are able to demonstrate leadership and demonstrate things that the business takes to be important, and demonstrate that first, and use that as an in to say, right, this is how you can help, because we have plans for individuals to actually help gather more data, for example, but it's pointless in us doing that before the systems are in place properly to collect that data. But the process is set up the systems for recording, and then give ownership to a few people of our employees to actually take responsibility for gathering that data and reporting on it, and then they'll have to engage the people below them in order to be able to do that. It shouldn't be up to one individual to try and engage a business, because that's not going to happen.
Thanks. Any other question? Is there anything on the chat? Okay, so I think we're coming to the end. I think it's like 5 minutes to 10 or something like that. So again, thanks a million to Iain for taking the time to put all that together and sharing our experience, his experience, and Highland Galvanizer experience to date. Has been, I think, very valuable. Thank you all again for taking the time to join us. It's much appreciated. And thank you, Sarah, for helping me today. So I will conclude these webinars. As I said earlier on, the slides and the videos will be available online with all the other webinars. And if you're interested in what you saw today or any other day, please do get in touch. Any question for Iain, just send it to us and then we'll pass them on. Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, bye.